Oh, well, then it's a perfect cue. Thank you very much.
To a country like Israel's constructive criticism of any of its policies that may not be in the best interest of the world. So let's hear the candidates' critiques of current Israeli policy. You can't say anything remotely critical of Israel and still get elected president. Which is funny, because you know where you can criticize Israel? Israel. So who scored? Let's go to the koshometer. How do Obama do?
Enough. Now, unfortunately, as you saw, that's beautiful timing, thank you. From that equation doesn't only apply in a Republican administration. It doesn't automatically change. Now, it's true that there is what I would call an unholy trinity at work when the Republicans are in power. The neoconservatives, the Christian evangelical Zionist right, and the more right-wing hawkish mainstream Jewish establishments, organizations. But let's not make life easy for ourselves and assume that everything will change overnight. And the other key thing, and Drummond mentioned it at the beginning, is the energy and attention that this sucks up in what is ultimately always only a limited agenda and number of things that an administration can deal with. President Clinton, as you reminded us, convened the parties at Camp David, was back and forth to the Middle East. Secretaries Albright and Christopher were constant features in our region. But look at the Bush administration. President Bush basically said, I'm not going to do that. ABC, anything but Clinton. I'm going to be the disengager. And yet here we are in July of 2008, and I just want to read something to you. Secretary Rice's travel schedule since she became Secretary of State 3.5 years ago. Visits to Israel, 20. Visits to China, 5. Visits to India, I think it's a small place in Asia, 2. And visits to all of Africa, although for us maybe you're happy that she's staying away more than visiting, but visits to the entire African continent 4 times. Now, if you were resolving the conflict, as Drummond said, in the first 6 months, I'd say, great, let's get this out the way. But that's not what has been happening. And if you'll indulge me for one moment, let me also say this. The current policy is a disaster for Israel. Resolving this conflict and ending the occupation is not throwing Israel under the bus. It's not selling out our beloved ally Israel. It's the single most pro-Israel thing anyone can do. Now, I was going to say the following thing, and then Rob Johnson ruined it. I was going to say Israel is like the frog in the hot water. More settlements, continued occupation, Palestinians don't believe in it, we're more entrenched. One day we wake up and it's too late. There is no solution that can still save Israel. But apparently the frog has jumped out long ago. So now let's go and prove that this frog is going to manage to jump out of the water. Look, the occupation is killing Israel. The current Israeli Prime Minister has said either we get a 2-state solution or we're finished. 41 of Israel's 60 years, it's occupied the West Bank and Gaza, and I don't need to tell you. It's strange to start with what it does to Israel, but let's start with what it does to Israel, because that's an argument that often needs to be won and is less obvious in this country. I don't need to tell you what it does to education when you're spending so much budget on the military, what it does to a society when it's maintaining an occupation. You now know these things firsthand better than me. And then, of course, there's the effect on the Palestinians. Many of you would have read the story recently of the 7 Fulbright scholars in Gaza. The New York Times front page, how to get them out so they could attend colleges in the US and use their Fulbrights. There are 1.4 million Gazans who apparently are not Fulbright scholars. There is 37% unemployment in Gaza. Ibu told us yesterday that 85% of Palestinians are under the age of 33. There are 8.6 dependents per breadwinner in the Gaza Strip. Gaza has been under a massive closure for 3 years now, and a significant closure before that. In the West Bank, which is approximately the size of Delaware, the second smallest state in the Union, there are 602 obstacles to freedom of Palestinian movement. Look, there are those of us fighting in Israel against this, but it's very difficult given that the suffocating nature I would say, and I'm not, look, it's our responsibility, Israelis, Palestinians, everyone in the region, but there's an American role here. Now, at this stage, it's kind of oy vey time. You throw up your hands, okay, this is terrible, nothing can be done, but I would argue that there are opportunities. John Edwards mentioned the other day that war can be an agent of change, and I think there are new opportunities, but like so many other things, we're going to have to connect the dots. Iraq, Iran, Israel, Palestine, political Islam, democratization, all don't exist in unconnected bubbles. They don't all exist in their own space. These things are connected, and if you don't connect the dots properly, it's like in a kid's drawing book. If you connect the dots wrong, it's a horrible mess on the page, and it's a horrible mess in the Middle East now because we're not connecting those dots. And I would argue that to fix anything, you're going to have to fix everything. And I briefly want to outline, very briefly apparently, although I'm going to ask you for time on that, some ideas and some directions for some solutions. First thing we need to start with is a diplomatic surge, not a military surge. And we need to remember the basics that seem controversial today. Somehow today it seems controversial to say that diplomacy is not appeasement, or engagement is not endorsement. I mean, mothball the State Department otherwise. Need to repair America's image and credibility. We looked at things here, Guantanamo, rendition, you know it better than me. Something big just happened on Iraq. The statements of Prime Minister Maliki during Obama's visit, I would argue when he talked about a timetable, I don't want to say game changer, I don't want to be over-optimistic, but I think that was significant. Bad news, though, it's not going to be enough because there are other situations that are going to get you bogged down in the Middle East if you don't address with them alongside redeploying and getting out of Iraq. And by the way, one of the things that's going to make Iraq more manageable is also doing it from the outside in, involving the neighbors. You can't involve the neighbors if you're not willing to talk to the Syrians, and if all you're willing to do with the Iranians is send your ambassador with duct tape over his mouth to sit with Europeans in Geneva. Iran. Let's just say it. War should not be an option.